signal? Good morning. Please stand. Join me for We'll Build a Land number 121 in the hymnal. We'll build a land where we bind up the broken. We'll build a land where the captives go free, where the oil of gladness dissolves all mourning. Oh, we'll build a promised land that can be. Come, build a land where sisters and brothers, anointed by love, may then create peace, where justice shall roll down like waters, and peace like an ever-flowing stream. We'll build a land where we bring the good tidings to all the afflicted and all those who mourn, and we'll give them God where peace is born. Come, build a land where sisters and brothers, anointed by love, may then create peace, where justice shall roll down like waters, and peace like an ever-flowing stream.
Good morning, and welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Church of Spokane, where our mission is to come together to create a nourishing, liberal, religious home and to champion justice, diversity, and environmental stewardship in our wider world. Or as we say in short, to create communing, find meaning, and work for justice. We are glad to have you with us. UUCS is a welcoming congregation where your unique experiences, backgrounds, beliefs, and lifestyle are appreciated. If you're one of our long-term members or have been here a short time or visiting for the very first time, we are glad you are with us. We are also grateful for those of you who are streaming the service today. We are delighted to have you with us. It is also my pleasure to welcome this morning as guest speaker Larry Cebula, a professor of history at Eastern Washington University and retired assistant? No, okay. He was the assistant digital archivist at Washington State Archives. I look forward to his insights and knowledge on the changing face of local history, and will introduce him more in depth later in the service. Now take a few moments to greet one another and be sure to say hello to someone you haven't met. Where's Stephanie? Oh, there you are. Stephanie. We now turn from our informal greeting of one another to formally begin our service by lighting our chalice, the symbol of Unitarian Universalism, the symbol of our unity and solidarity, of our openness and inclusion, of our community and individual uniqueness. May this small flame be an offering of warmth to those who are cold and alone, and a light to those in darkness. May it be a flame that ignites justice in our world and a beacon of hope to those in need. And may it reflect at least a spark of truth wherever truth has been lost, and cast a healthy shadow of doubt wherever it has been found. For the opening reflection by Howard Zinn, an American historian. History is instructive. What it suggests to people is that even if they do little things, if they walk on the picket line, if they join a vigil, if they write a letter to their local newspaper, anything they do, however small, becomes a part of a much larger sort of flow of energy. And when enough people do enough things, however small they are, then change takes place.
Please stand, join me for number 352, Find a Stillness. Find a stillness, hold a stillness, let the stillness carry me. Find the silence, hold the silence, let the silence carry me. In the Spirit, by the Spirit, with the Spirit giving power, I will find true harmony. Seek the essence, hold the essence, let the essence carry me. Let me flower, help me flower, watch me flower, carry me. In the Spirit, by the Spirit, with the Spirit giving power, I will find true harmony.
We will now kindle our candles of care. Each time we gather as a congregation, there are always those with us in our hearts and minds, and who we want to wrap in our love and care. Let's light a candle of celebration for Elaine Stevens, who will be 90 years of age on July 4th, and member Joyce Lampier, a candle for her. She turns 90 on July 26th. Let's also light a candle of gratitude for Darrell Vanderlinden, who is now home and doing well after spinal fusion surgery last week. We also kindle candles for those caught up in the strife in the Middle East and Ukraine. Let us share a moment of silence, embracing others who are here and in our hearts and minds this morning. You are welcome to say their names aloud as you are willing. Those named aloud and those embraced in our silence, and all those who are suffering elsewhere in our world at this hour, we hold in our community of compassion. We now gratefully give and receive this morning's offering, which sustains this community and its mission to the wider world.
sun's gonna shine in my back door someday. Trouble in mind, it's true. I've almost lost my mind. Never had so much trouble in my life before. I'm going down to the river, gonna take my old rocking chair, and if the blues don't leave me, I'll rock away from there. Trouble in mind, I'm blue, but I won't be blue always, 'cause the sun's gonna shine in my back door someday. 'Cause the sun's gonna shine in my back door someday.
All right, at this time, any children are welcome to come down for our story for all ages. The story takes us way back in time to the beginning of the world. It's adapted from an Aboriginal creation story from Australia. When the earth was newborn, it was plain and without any features of life. There were no rivers or mountains, no trees, no grasses, just red, flat earth as far as the eye could see, except there were no eyes for seeing yet. Waking time and sleeping time were the same. There were only hollows on the surface of the earth, which one day would become water holes. Around the water holes were the ingredients for life. Underneath the crust of the earth were the stars and the sky, the sun and the moon, and all forms of life, all sleeping. All the tiniest details of life were present, yet not awake or alive. The head feathers of a cockatoo, the thump of a kangaroo's tail, the gleam of an insect's wing, the rustle of eucalyptus leaves in the wind. A time came when time itself split apart and sleeping time separated from waking time. This moment was called the dream time, and at this moment, everything started to burst into life. The sun rose through the surface of the earth and shone warm rays onto the hollows, melting the ice which became the water holes. Underneath each water hole lay an ancestor, an ancient man or woman who had been asleep through the ages. The sun filled the bodies of each ancestor with light and life, and the ancestors began to give birth to children. Their children were all the living things of the world, from the tiniest little grub wiggling on a leaf to the broadest winged eagle soaring in the blue sky. Rising from the water holes, the ancestors stood up with mud falling from their bodies. As the mud slipped away, the sun opened the ancestors' eyelids. They saw the creatures they had made from their own bodies. Each ancestor gazed at their creation in pride and wonderment. Each ancestor sang out with joy, "I am." One ancestor said, "I am a kangaroo." What would a kangaroo look like? Yeah, you want to show me? No? Okay, maybe when we're outside. Another saying, "I am a cockatoo." The next saying, "I am a honey ant." And the next saying, "I am a lizard." As they sang, naming their own creations, they began to walk. Their footsteps and their music became one, calling all living things into being and weaving them into life with song. The ancestors sang their way all around the world. They sang the rivers into the valleys, and the sand into the dunes, the trees into leaf, and the mountains to rise above the plain. As they walked, they left a trail of music. Then they were exhausted. They had shown all living things how to live, and they returned into the earth itself to sleep. We don't see them, but they are still present in every sacred space, and their music still hums in the world. And now please join me in singing our children out to Play Club.
For the meditation, words from Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. Someday, after mastering the winds, the waves, the tides, and gravity, we shall harness for God the energies of love, and then, for a second time in the history of the world, man will have discovered fire.
Fish in the sea, you know how I feel. River running free, you know how I feel. Blossom in the tree, you know how I feel. It's a new dawn, it's a new day, it's a new life for me. And I'm feeling good. Dragonfly out in the sun, you know what I mean. Butterflies all having fun, you know what I mean. Sleep in peace when the day is done, that's what I mean. And this old world is a new world and a bold world for me. And I'm feeling good. Stars when you shine, you know how I feel. Scent of the pine, you know how I feel. Oh, freedom is mine, and I know how I feel. It's a new dawn, it's a new day, it's a new life for me. And I'm feeling good.
Our guest speaker today is Larry Cebula, who will present The Changing Face of Local History. He will be speaking about monument removals, including a statue honoring John Monaghan that stands in front of the Spokane Club, and the current trend of renaming things such as roads, schools, and athletic teams. Larry is the author of Plateau Indians and the Quest for Spiritual Power and Nearby History, Exploring the Past Around You. Please give a warm welcome to Larry Cebula.
Well, thank you all, and thank you for inviting me here this morning. The real history of Spokane has not been told, but we're getting closer bit by bit, and that's all hopefully we'll explain today. But first I should back up a little bit. What do we mean by history? And we're in this very culturally polarized and divided time, and a lot of the fights we're having often revolve around history. And I think it comes down to people having different definitions of it. To some, and maybe to your high school history teacher, history is a list of things that happened in the past, names and dates and presidents and generals and so on. And you memorize those things and you know history. I don't think any professional historian thinks that's a good definition of history. Most of us would describe history as something more like a conversation between the past and the present. We ask questions about the past that help explain the world to us, because history explains the world like no other discipline. And the answers that come back to our questions, that's history. And every generation asks different questions of the past, and so you get different answers back. A process that's sometimes dismissed as historical revisionism, but I would say is just doing the work of history. Next slide, please. And originally I had titled my talk, The Agony of Local History, because I think local history, far more than national history, is undergoing a much needed revolution right now. And we're getting better all the time. I'll explain that in a bit. Next slide, please. Let me give you an example of some bad local history. Bad in multiple meanings of the word. I think you all know this fellow on the left, Fort George Wright. The street out in front of us was named after him until recently. In 1858, in response to some Indians basically defending their land here in eastern Washington, George Wright roars up out of Fort Walla Walla with about 600 men and unleashes what he calls a campaign of terror, his word, against the American Indians in this region. He defeats them in a series of battles. More controversially, he often hangs some of the prisoners he takes. He had no legal authority to do that. He just did it anyway. And so there's a series of these battles, Four Lakes being the first for Wright, and then Spokane Plains and so on. Next slide. And here is a monument. It was also in my first slide that you have all driven past very closely. Does anybody know where this is? In the back? Yeah, it's at Four Lakes. It's for the Battle of Four Lakes. It's just off the road. If you're driving to Cheney, there's a little brown sign that says history marker. And take that turn the next time and check out this monument. It was established in 1935, and it says basically on this site, I won't read it word for word, but the Fort George Wright defeated 5,000 Allied Indians, and they've ever since maintained a lasting peace. There were 500 Indians at that battle. According to George Wright himself, according to his colonels, according to Spokane tribal traditions, the forces were roughly equally matched in numbers. Wright had far more advanced weaponry. If there had been 5,000 Indians, this would be George Wright's grave marker, and not a monument to a successful battle. So why does it say 5,000, and why has it stood there for almost 100 years saying 5,000? By the way, a couple of years ago I went out to look at it, and somebody had tried to fill in the last zero with some quick concrete. I swear it wasn't me. And it's since worn away again. I think this illustrates just how bad local history has often been in the past. Next slide. And there are reasons why local history, and there's always been some good work. I don't want to trash everybody who's come before me by any means. But there's been fairly few people working in local history. As opposed to the Battle of Gettysburg, where there's this vast literature of military history experts who have been trained at universities to do history. Local history has often been done by passionate amateurs, people who love the history of their town and want to tell people about it, but aren't really trained in historical research and don't always have good sources to them. More about that in a minute. Because there are fewer people working on it, there's less peer review. Peer review is the academic concept where before your work goes before the public, someone else who's an expert in that field takes a look at it. That mostly didn't happen for local history. There are fewer primary sources as well as fewer secondary sources to work with. But more problematic is the ideology that informed a lot of local history. And I don't want to make it all sound malign, but a lot of people do local history because they're proud of their town and they want people to know it. But if you enter your research with your basic preposition, my town is great, it shapes what you're going to find and what you're going to talk about. It can be more malign than that. Often we get a white supremacist ideology in local history, and that's exactly what we see on that Four Lakes monument. That ties right into Birth of the Nation and other writings like that, where it's always small numbers of white people defeat huge numbers of people of color because of Aryan racial supremacy. That's just below the surface on that Four Lakes monument. So what are the sources from which local history has traditionally been written? Next slide, please. A lot of them are settler narratives from people like this, Dan Drumheller. You've probably heard of Drumheller Springs here in Spokane. Drumheller was a very early white settler to this region. He told his life story in a series of newspaper articles that were later collected into a little book called Uncle Dan Drumheller Tells Thrilling Tales of Western Adventure, or something like that. And he talks about coming out on the Oregon Trail and being one of the early cattlemen in eastern Washington. He eventually becomes mayor of Spokane, Washington. What he doesn't talk about in his book is the time he murdered an Indian downtown. I think it's about 1873. The first bridge has been constructed across the Spokane River. Drumheller's herding some sheep across there. An Indian man decides it would be funny to spook the sheep and jumps up and scares them. Drumheller knocks the Indian down with a stick. The Indian comes back with a gun. Some people intervene. The Indian's arrested. He's put into jail. That night, in the Spokane jail, which stood exactly where the Apple store is today, and the Spokane jail is just this very loose log cabin on unchinked logs, and the Indian's in there. Somebody sneaks up to the edge, puts a candle on one of the logs so they can see inside, and shoots the native man with a shotgun, and he's killed. Dan Drumheller is arrested the next day for this. They must have had cause to arrest him, and the charges are dropped at some point. The records just aren't very clear from that far back, and Drumheller goes on. But in all the stories of local history about Dan Drumheller, I had never run into that one, except in a few old newspapers. Next slide. And newspapers are a source for local history, but until recently, they're fairly inaccessible. You had to go to the Spokane Public Library and ask to see the old microfilm. And my God, it's needle in a haystack time doing that kind of research. But also newspapers are often called the first draft of history, but it's a certain kind of history. Newspapers are published and owned by the rich and powerful, and they write about other people sometimes, and sometimes they do not. Next slide. Census data and maps are a traditional source of local history. Again, pretty difficult to access until recently. Next slide. And perhaps most influential are these county histories. This was written in 1914. The city of Spokane and the Spokane country, and these early titles go on and on. It's like a paragraph long. But it was written by a man named Durham, who had been the editor of the Spokesman Review. In 1914, he had the advantage of being able to talk to a lot of old white pioneers, and he did. So there's a lot of information in here, but it's from a certain point of view, celebrating the white settlers who came and took the land from the Indians. Next slide. And finally, one of the problems with local history has been what I call the mimeograph syndrome. And I need to come up with a better phrase for it, because when I talk to my students at Eastern Washington University about mimeograph machines, they look at me with a perfectly blank stare. I think many of us in this room are old enough to remember making copies of copies of copies, and they get less and less legible as you go along. And local history is like that for a long time. So here we see Durham's 1914 book, and there is an author named Kay who wrote a series of books about Spokane history in the 1970s and 80s, and it's basically just the same thing from Durham rehashed one more time. The next slide. All of that is changing and changing very fast right now. We're in a revolution of understanding our own history, not in just this community, but in others. And there's a number of reasons for that. Next slide. And the first one is just all of the additional records coming on to the internet. When the internet opened its big fat mouth, 20 some odd years ago, I used to work at the Washington State Digital Archives, and one of their first projects was imaging all of the birth, death, and marriage records for the state and putting those up online. And of course, a death certificate for someone is often a short biography of that person, where they were born, who their parents were, what they died from, what their employment was. You put those together for everybody who died in Washington State, and it's an incredible resource for our history. And not just the digital archives, but things like Google Books and Ancestry and newspapers getting digitized. We have a flood of information, and a digital source is keyword searchable, which is a great convenience, to put it mildly. Next slide. Another thing that's changing the way we do local history is electronic communication. And it's enabling people who do local history to talk to each other on the regular and begin to get that peer review and that fact checking in a community of local historians who can help each other out. This is a Facebook group I created about 6 or 8 years ago called Spokane History Researchers, because I realized there were people who knew things about the history of Spokane that I didn't. And I thought I could maybe lure them to join my Facebook group so they do their homework for me. And there's 6,000 members of it now. And there are on the daily people asking historical questions and getting answers on this. It's not a nostalgia group. It's not like, who remembers cruising Riverside? Oh yeah, that was cool. Those groups exist already. This is for doing research. And out of this group has come people publishing books and articles and stuff that are of a better quality than they would have been without that communication. Next slide. The largest thing that's changing local history, though, are the new voices coming into it, the new attitudes, the new questions that I alluded to at the beginning. We're in the middle of a racial reckoning in this country post George Floyd. And it's a racial reckoning that's being, mightily resisted. I don't have to tell you that, but it's happening anyway. And it's making us look at our history again and see how much of it is based on things like white supremacy. And it's also bringing in new scholars. My first book was about the history of American Indians in our region, and I was one of fairly few people writing about that in 2003 when the book came out. There are a lot of people working on it now, and a lot of them are American Indians themselves. So I very much stepped back from that field, and not in any bad way, but encouraging these people I see as the true guardians of this history coming out and telling it. So new voices and attitudes are changing local history. Let me very quickly show you some examples of the historical projects going on in our town. Next slide. And next slide. One, we talked about statue removal. This is James Monaghan. He stands in front of the Spokane Club. For years, I would begin my public history class with showing a picture of the statue of James Monaghan. I would ask my students, most of them from the Spokane area, who's seen this before? And they'd all raise their hands. I'd say, who is it? And their hands would go down, they'd look at the ground and hope I didn't call on them. Until finally, about 10 years ago, a student said, oh, that's James Monaghan. And I could have fallen out of my chair. I said, how do you know that? Young guy. And he says, well, I'm Samoan. There's a big community of Samoans here in Spokane, people who've been transplanted. We all know who that guy is. James Monaghan died in the American invasion of Samoa, I think 1899. He died heroically in what was a pretty brutal and horrible war where American warships shelled villages full of women and children, and then Monaghan and the others would go in and burn what was left of the villages. He was ambushed. He died defending his commander. Being from Spokane and being the first graduate of a military academy from Spokane, he went to Annapolis. He was celebrated, and they built this statue of him. But the student said to me, he goes, all of us Samoans know who it is. My mom would point out, and she'd go, there was and he used a Samoan phrase I won't try to replicate, but it translates to a poor baby. There's the poor baby who tried to destroy us and tried to destroy our culture, but we got him. So the only people in Spokane who knew who the statue was until the recent controversy are the Samoans. So there's a group of Asian Pacific Islanders who've banded together, who've been lobbying the government to remove this statue. A process is being established, and I think ultimately it's probably going to come down in the next year or two as not being something worthy of celebration. Next slide. African American history is a rich vein of research that's finally happening in Spokane. Of course, there were African American pioneers from the very earliest days of Spokane settlement, many of them former slaves. There's a man named Peter Barrow who was born a slave, became a state legislature in Louisiana during Reconstruction, fled to the Pacific Northwest when the Klan rose up in Louisiana, established a church here in Spokane, established businesses. So there's a lot of research being done. On the left is a book, Black Spokane by Dwayne Mack. That's a very good introduction to that. But the research continues. On the right is a flyer for something I was honored to participate in last fall, a community scanning day at the Carl Maxey Center. So the Spokane Public Library and the Carl Maxey Center worked together, and they said to the Black community in Spokane, bring us your historic photographs. Bring us your historic documents. We will scan them. We will put them into a digital archive. We will give the original document back to you, also a flash drive with the scans of them on it. Help us build a database of Black Spokane history. So we set it up one Saturday, and by the end of the day, we had scanned 540 photographs and documents of Black Spokane history. You can begin to access them at the Spokane Public Library webpage right now if you look for the Carl Maxey Center collection. Next slide. Something that's just beginning to be explored in a meaningful way is LGBTQ history in Spokane, Washington. Someone once said to me that LGBTQ people are the one minority that's randomly distributed through the population in every generation. And it's absolutely true. And they're everywhere and have been everywhere and have been a part of our history forever. But it's a history no one's explored until recently. This is just a portion of a timeline called the Spokane Pride and Remembrance Project. I'll have a QR code at the end of this presentation, and there are links to all of these in it. And some people in Spokane have begun really thoroughly mining the LGBTQ history in Spokane. And it's deep and it's rich and it has many stories I've never heard before, having studied Spokane history for 20 years. It's exciting. And I think this timeline will become in the future a museum exhibit, will become a book, will tell us much more about our history that we didn't know. Next slide. Another history that's too often ignored is early Chinese and Japanese history in Spokane. In 1906, there were so many Japanese businessmen in Spokane, they put out their own directory of Japanese-owned businesses in Spokane. It's you can look at this directory at the MAC. I think they might have digitized it. There are also many, many Chinese in the early history of Spokane, many of them former railroad workers who came here and ran laundries and did vegetable gardening and stuff like that. And their history is more or less forgotten until recently. On the right is an exhibit that I think is still up at the Spokane Public Library, but if it is, it's only up for a few more days. It's called Remembering Trent Alley, and it's a rich, powerful museum-quality exhibit about the Chinese and Japanese in early Spokane. It brings together a lot of research I've never seen before, and again, I think it will become a publication. Next slide. This is my baby, Spokane Historical. Probably some of you have blundered into this along the way. It's a smartphone app and a website for local history. At Eastern Washington University, my students, instead of writing me a paper at the end of class that I put a grade on and then they throw it away, they write a story for this website, about a place-based story about a historic site in Spokane. We have 700 stories there now. Next slide. And finally, this is my last example of how local history is changing. I'll touch on this only briefly because my former student, Logan Campo-Reale, I know spoke to this group about this a year ago. But the Racial Covenants Project. For those of you who don't know, a racial covenant is a covenant is a document binding on a property that says how the property may and may not be used. Starting in the mid-20th century in Spokane and every other place in America, some developers, and not all, began to add racial restrictions. Only members of the Caucasian race may live on this property. Those were struck down in 1968. You couldn't write them anymore, but they're still in the and they're not enforceable, but they're still in the chain of title for 7,500 homes in Spokane. With some funding from the state legislature, a team of us have been working on locating all of these. So I think most people don't know if they have one, so people can find out if they have one of these and instructions on how they can remove it. In a week or two, you can't see it very well here, but we're working on a GIS map where you can enter a street address and see if there's a racial covenant on that property, and then remove it if that's your will. On the other hand, next slide, and I couldn't bear myself to do a screen capture here, so I was going over this presentation I put together. I was feeling pretty cocky, pretty good, yeah, it's Spokane history, we're getting it right, finally. And so I just Googled Spokane history, and my number one hit was a TikTok video from some TikToker, and it was about the network of secret hidden tunnels under Spokane, Washington. Which I can tell you for a fact do not exist. They're called basements. They're not a series of tunnels. It's one of these myths that goes on and on. But this guy, who I had talked to in the past and told, no, that's not true, decided to make his TikTok video anyway, and he has 34,000 hits and a couple hundred comments about how cool this is and how I'm going to explore those hidden tunnels next weekend. Good luck with that. So local history is getting a lot better with new voices and new sources, and we have a ways to go at the same time. Both are true. That's my presentation.
Thank you so much. So we did this the first service. We have a few minutes left, and if you're okay doing it, does anybody have any questions? We don't have a mic to go around, so you have to make your questions short enough that he can repeat them so that people listening online can hear them. Yeah.
I'm sure you know that statue removals and that are very controversial. People have various opinions. What some people say is leave the statue up, but put something next to it that says we don't have these attitudes anymore, or these attitudes aren't acceptable. So then what do you think about that kind of, if it is a compromise position?
Yeah. The question was, what about leaving controversial statues up and interpreting them better with some panels and stuff? It's been done in some places. I forget exactly what the monument is, but somewhere in western Washington, there's a state historical marker that's pretty racist, and the local against Indians, and the local tribe has come in and put up a bunch of plaques around it explaining this history isn't really true, and here's what actually happened. What I love best about that is apparently the tribe just did it. It's on state land, but the tribe showed up one weekend and installed these plaques, and nobody has the cojones to take them back down, nor should they. It's not a bad idea. The people most affected by the statue seem to want it gone, and this guy committed some war crimes, so I don't know. It's a decision not to be made by historians, but by the community working together. Other questions? Yes?
When I was growing up here in Spokane, that area where Qualchen Hills Golf Course is,
Right.
and all those housing developments, was all Japanese farms.
Okay.
Why they went away?
I've seen that in old maps as well, and what's the park right to the right of Sunset Hill as you climb up on the interstate? Anyway, that area was also a lot of Chinese and Japanese farms. I don't know, except that most people leave farming when they have the opportunity. I used to teach in Southwest Missouri at a university, and all my students were farmers' kids, and I'd say, how many of you are going to farm? And are you crazy? That's why we're here. So I think they just advanced economically, is my guess. Yes, in the back.
What are the common names and locations in Spokane is Vinegar Flats.
Sure.
What can you tell us about that background, that
Sure, a good friend of mine lives in Vinegar Flats. It's a fascinating area. Of course, that was the home of the upper Spokane Indians, who've camped, camped is not the right word, lived all up and down Hangman or Latah Creek. It's called Vinegar Flats because of vinegar works there. And in the 19th century, Americans were crazy about vinegar in a way we can hardly understand because it was such a useful preservative in the age before refrigeration. Also a highway that used to go through Vinegar Flats, and not where Inland Empire Way is now, but on the other side of the creek, connected Canada to Mexico. It was called the Three Kings Highway. And along it, there's a little bit of a concrete structure, and it doesn't look like it, but it's an old horse trough to water people's horses as they came up the hill into Spokane. Again? Oh, sorry.
I've seen a couple of interesting documentaries about battlefield archaeology, which digs up these old historical things, like under, I think it's Vilnius, Lithuania. They dug up all these bodies and so on, and all these uniforms. Turns out there were the soldiers from Napoleon who died in thousands.
Right.
What's going on around here like that?
The question is what kind of battlefield archaeology is being, or other archaeology. I'm not an archaeologist. I know a little bit about it. Of course, with anything with Native Americans, there's a lot of sensitivity there, quite properly so, in wanting to work with them. And very often they're not, digging up their ancestors' remains is not something they are in favor of. I don't know what battlefield archaeology has been done, for example, for Four Lakes, because I think a lot of that land around Four Lakes is relatively undisturbed since the fight there. Of course, there's like metal detectorists out there who are just a bane on the historian's existence, because they take stuff out of context. And where exactly a bullet is found could tell you a lot about a battle. A bullet in some guy's pocket, like, oh, yeah, I found this out at Four Lakes somewhere, tells us like nothing at all. A former student of mine works at the MAC now as an archivist there, and she got an inquiry from some person. She showed me one day while I was there saying, yeah, I need a map of the horse slaughter camp because I'm a metal detectorist. So I'm going to go out there and dig up a bunch of stuff at the battlefield site. And she's there. No, absolutely not. I'm not helping you. But there's a lot archaeology can tell us, absolutely. I don't know what the state of it is right now. In the back again?
Yeah, can you tell us about trolleys in the Spokane G, Liberty Lake area, one part, and then the other interurban line that I know went from Spokane down through some of the small towns in our county and Whitman County?
Yeah. I mean, trolleys are absolutely central to the growth of Spokane and every American city in the late 18 and early 1900s, before automobiles especially. And all of our neighborhoods in Spokane, all our historic ones, are more or less laid out along what were trolley tracks. The interurban lines continued out to Cheney, into Medical Lake, into Coeur d'Alene. Wouldn't it be nice to have that again? And there was something called the Bug, which was a line that you're talking about that went down into like Rockford, and I don't think it went as far as Pullman. I think it ended in Colfax, but I'm not sure about that. Is there a question over here? Yes.
I'm wondering what you know about the old cemetery that is north of Hilliard, and I think some of us became aware of it when it was vandalized and defaced some years ago. And I believe there are military people buried there, and I just wonder, and also what might be being done to kind of preserve it or take care of it.
Yeah. Cemeteries are a particular fascination for me. They're open-air museums of the common man. The one I think you're talking about, I visited on a bike ride recently, and if we're talking about the same one, it was in part a cemetery for converted Indians for the Catholic mission that was there. Those graves were mostly unmarked, so I think the people are still there, and then later white farmers in the area. As far as the maintenance of cemeteries, it's almost entirely volunteer. When all of these were founded, there was a cemetery association that would take care of it, and usually out of budget and stuff. And especially for the small rural ones, over the years, everybody's just kind of died. And there's usually a local farmer who weed eats the cemetery or something like that. But I've seen some that are completely abandoned. They're not owned by government, and I don't know of any government programs to maintain them. Anything else? Is there anybody on Zoom who wants to, or do we not Zoom the 11th?
It's just the first service where we have Zoomers, yeah.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Please stand for our final hymn, number 131.
Love will guide us, peace has tried us, hope inside us will lead the way on the road from greed to giving. Love will guide us through the hard night. If you cannot sing like angels, if you cannot speak before thousands, you can give from deep within you. You can change the world with your love. Love will guide us, peace has tried us, hope inside us will lead the way on the road from greed to giving. Love will guide us through the hard night.
The closing words are from Ban Ki-moon. Throughout human history, in any great endeavor requiring the common effort of many nations and men and women everywhere, we have learned is only through seriousness of purpose and persistence that we ultimately carry the day. We might liken it to riding a bicycle. You stay upright and move forward so long as you keep up the momentum. Amen. Blessed be. Salam alaikum and shalom.
Shalom Chaverim, Shalom Chaverim, Shalom, Shalom, Shalom Chaverim, Shalom.